Hey everyone, James from TeaDB here, bringing you another Inbetweenisode. So part of the COVID-19 series of Inbetweenisodes that I'm releasing. So trying out just a few different episode ideas. So today, and those of you that read TeaDB regularly might be familiar with this, I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the concepts in this book. And I don't think the concept originated from this book, but it's where I learned about it. Range, really good book by David Epstein. The book is titled Range: Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World. So the concept I'm going to be talking about are kind and wicked environments / scenarios. And the post that I wrote about this is called Storage is Wicked, Long and Short Feedback Loops, Innovation in Pu'erh Storage. So the concept of kind and wicked scenarios is really interesting, and I had not heard of it until I read this book. So the basic idea is that kind scenarios are ones where feedback is fast, patterns repeat. Generally, it's possible to get good at it by repetitions. This doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be a master or an expert at it, but you can improve more close to linearly by just doing it. So some of the examples in the book are classical music and golf. In my opinion, something like brewing tea is a reasonable example of a kind scenario. Obviously, these things can be on a pretty significant spectrum, so there are very few things that are 100% wicked and very few things that are 100% kind. But brewing tea, for example, is you can get the feedback very fast in the form of just drinking a cup of tea. We are usually doing several infusions for tea, and when it comes to just doing it again, it's easy enough in most cases to just brew up another, do another session with the tea, do things a little bit differently. So while it's undoubtedly true that it's really difficult to become really an expert at brewing, and I don't mean to diminish that at all, but if you are willing to devote your attention, your time, even watch a couple of YouTube videos, which you are probably doing if you are watching this, to just look at how other people are brewing, read up about it, you can become competent at it. You have an idea of what you're creating each time you brew a tea. So you would have some idea what you're going to get as far as the result of it, rather than being like, oh, I don't know what this pu'erh is going to taste like this time. It'll probably taste similar to how you brewed it last time if you're using similar parameters. Okay, so a little bit rambly there, but going to keep on moving to, I think, the more interesting one, which are wicked scenarios, which the author Epstein argues are more common. These are trickier scenarios. They got the poo burps. They often have bad or impartial or even no feedback at all. So while we're brewing tea, we can taste what it tastes like and adjust from there. For these scenarios, it's a lot harder, and they can also be a lot noisier. So I think there are some things in tea that fit really cleanly into this category as well. The thing that immediately came to mind for me is pu'erh tea, aging, and storage. One of those things is selecting tea that you think will age well, and it's also just sort of tied into storage generally. So one of those things that sort of gets treated with a little bit of mysticism as well as just like mystery, and personally I find endlessly fascinating, is just aged pu'erh, how it ages, and that kind of thing. And so here's a couple reasons why I argue this fits into that wicked environment, wicked scenario category. One, feedback is very slow and impartial. It takes a very long time to age pu'erh. So if we think about just a drier form of storage, kunming, something that's like 10 or 15 years old, still will usually have that really green edge to it. If we think of something, I'll talk a little bit about this later, something like the 1988 Qingbing, which was stored in Hong Kong, by the way, so not exactly a super dry place, or that took into the mid-2000s to really pick up steam and become something that people sought after. So 15 years there. So for a tea that is often marketed as really old, ancient, and traditional, I would personally push back a little bit on a lot of those notions, as I think a lot of what we're drinking in Pu'erh is fairly modern creations. But as something that's really marketed towards those things, those aspects of it, the idea of storing something dryly, it's relatively new. Really not something that picked up steam until the last 20 years or so. All right, so that's one. Feedback is slow and impartial. Another example that I mentioned in the piece is you can't exactly take a Pu'erh and you drink it when you first get it, so when it's 0 to 1 years old, and then drink it in 3 years, and if it's improved, say that tea is definitely going to continue to age well, and that tea is going to be a fantastic 20-year-old tea. If we take something that is known commonly in the Pu'erh world as sort of like an awkward phase, where the tea has started to lose those fresh notes, but really hasn't aged to develop much complexity or some of those interesting age layers to it, so it's 3 or 4 years old, is usually when we start to see that phase. You might think that this tea is going to age really poorly, but that's not necessarily the case. A tea that tastes good at 3 years old may not be the best 20-year-old tea, and a tea that doesn't taste that great at 3 years old may end up turning out to be pretty all right. So it's difficult to sort of judge sometimes in the middle of sort of these transformations what is going to be in the end the better tea in the long term. So it just means that our feedback is not great. It's slow, it's incomplete, and there's also a significant subjective component to it. There's personal preference. Some people like Kunming storage. Others prefer something a little bit more hot and humid, like Taiwanese storage. There's a ton of opinions, and there's, in my opinion, no obvious consensus to it. Most people will agree that you could have tea that is too wet or too dry, but where that level is depends a lot on the person, their own background. Another thing that also sort of obfuscates the truth, or obfuscates, or at least just prevents us from really getting at more objective truths of the matter is the idea that most of the vendors that are storing Pu'erh also have a significant financial incentive to promote their own storage. Generally speaking, people that are based in Taiwan, vendors that are based in Taiwan, are going to like Taiwan storage and say that that is better than Hong Kong storage. The same goes for Hong Kong, the same goes for Taiwan, the same goes for Malaysia. So we just have, so in the end, we often look towards these vendors and these people that know a lot about Pu'erh as sort of these beacons of truth and knowledge, and in many ways they are. But when it comes to Pu'erh storage, a lot of these, it's hard not to get mixed up a little bit with their financial incentives as well as sort of the subjective components. If we grow up and we drink a lot of Malaysian storage and that's what we know, we may just have a natural bias towards it, and that's nobody's fault, but it is something that certainly does exist. And a final thing that is challenging is that just certain setups are easier in different parts of the world. We're just dealing with different climates, different hands. Hands are dealt to each of us. So trying to sort through that and figure that out is not easy and not challenging. I could store a tea here naturally in Seattle in the exact same way that my friend Peter might in San Diego, and we could end up with fairly different results. And by that I mean we just have the same basic setup. And that's just a fact of like the climates. And our climates are probably more similar than they are different when we start to think about other places in the world, such as we get closer to the equator and talk about Singapore and other places like that. So in the end, these are sort of reasons why I think Pu'erh storage is really, really challenging and difficult. And it's also why I think that certain advice that comes from the East isn't necessarily directly applicable when it comes to the West. People in Taiwan are just dealing with a very different storage hand than we are in the West. Okay, so finally, one of the other sort of things that the author Epstein focuses on in the book is just how these wicked scenarios sort of leave a lot of room for innovation. I think it's still not obvious, at least it's not obvious to me, how much certain aspects matter and in what way. Things like airflow, temperature, seasonal change, even humidity. It's obvious that these do matter in the end product of Pu'erh. Exactly how they matter and exactly what the right amounts are not totally clear. So I think there's a lot of room for innovation in the Pu'erh space, and specifically one of the experiments I cite is Markle's experiment, which I think is really interesting and sort of focuses on controlling the humidity and just raising that temperature and just seeing what the results are. If we think about something like the 88 Qingbing, which really sort of came along and was a really important cake as far as like developing dry storage and appreciation of those teas. Not going to say it necessarily invented dry storage, but it was it's probably the most famous example of it, at least the one I see cited the most often. It wasn't until within the last 20 years that this really was something that was even sought after. You could get it probably pretty darn cheaply if you were to buy it 16, 17 years ago with the time machine and you went to Best Tea House then. So what we look at the gold standard of Pu'erh storage has not been the gold standard of Pu'erh storage for hundreds of years. It's just a relatively recent thing, and the same holds true for dry storage in general. So I think that just about wraps up this Inbetweenisode. One thing that I just wanted to conclude on is that, it's not an unnatural reaction to look at Pu'erh in the West and see some of the wacky solutions that people are doing, Pomodors, hot boxes, things like that. But I think there's a certain logic to it, and I think if we look at the patterns of innovation in this field, that's obviously extremely challenging, but I think also is just not totally explored, considering how slow and how impartial the feedback is. So for me, I think the reason why we are seeing all these different innovations in the Western world, specifically on Pu'erh storage, I think to me, I find that to be very encouraging, and I think it's a very good thing, even though it can look a little strange and wacky from the outside, or if you're just new to the world. So thank you all for tuning in. Let me know how you enjoyed this episode, and I will see you all soon.